Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion featuring Victor McFarland and David Rundell. Both Victor and David have recently published highly acclaimed books detailing different aspects of Saudi Arabia and the kingdom's ascent over the past several decades. This is our second book talk that is focused on Saudi Arabia in the last few months. In September, we were pleased to welcome Ben Hubbard and Suzanne Kelbel to discuss their books, MBS and Behind the Kingdom's Veil. Those books provided a fascinating look at the contemporary issues challenging Saudi Arabia and its leadership. Our two books today, David Rundell's Vision or Mirage and Victor McFarland's book, Oil Powers, provide a much more historic perspective both on Saudi Arabia's internal development and its critical relationship with the United States. I can say with complete honesty that both books make for fascinating reads. You can find links to purchase both books on MEI's website and in the Zoom chat. I'm particularly pleased to welcome my old friend and colleague, David Rundell, to MEI today. David and I served in Riyadh together over 30 years ago, but I'm delighted to note that David was clearly far more observant of developments in the kingdom than I was. Moderating today's discussion is Kristen Dewan, Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute here in Washington. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Coordination Council, or even the Gulf Cooperation Council. Thank you so much, Victor, David, and Kristen for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to your conversation. Now, just a few quick housekeeping notes before I turn the program over to Kristen. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please also email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel discussion. Kristen will be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. And with that, let me turn over to Kristen for her comments and introduction.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Let me just say first, it's a great pleasure to be here with the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for inviting me. And also just for this opportunity to moderate this panel with these two ambassadors and scholars that are making a real contribution to our understanding of the kingdom and its relationship with the United States. And at this critical time, the panel title that you provided us with is a New Saudi Arabia, Social Change, Economic Obstacles, and Western Alliances. And I think that's certainly the case. We're really looking at a very new Saudi Arabia today. If you talk to people in the kingdom, often you even see pundits sometimes refer to this as even the fourth state in Saudi Arabia. So dramatic are the changes that are taking place there, which involve, both a consolidation within the ruling family, centralization of power within the state, dramatic social changes that involve basically shifting even the reliance that they used to have on not only religious scholars, which of course they still have, but also the religious reinforcement and allowing for a lot of changes, this dramatic kind of entertainment and tourism that we're seeing opening up in the kingdom, and the opening for women to play a much bigger role within the economy and also in public space. The dramatic changes of the Vision 2030 program and the intensified efforts to diversify the economy. And of course, all of this being wrapped up in a much stronger new nationalism that's defining the way that they're relating to the people and also relating more outside of the country, with their regional partners and rivals. And all of these things, of course, are weighing very much on the U.S.-Saudi relationship and changing that. And I guess that's one of the things that we're going to want to be talking through, is to look at how much of these things, how are we supposed to understand these changes in the kingdom, and how are they then affecting, the relationships with their Western partners, and in particular the United States. And like I said, we're just really benefiting so much from having the scholars from two recent books. As the ambassador said, joining us today is David Rundell, who, as he mentioned, has just published this book, Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads, which really is just a textbook. I think that's probably going to be trading hands with a lot of diplomats, in addition to general readership, because it really gives this kind of comprehensive history while also looking forward. David Rundell, of course, is a very distinguished diplomat, having served for 30 years in Washington, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Tunisia, and the UAE. But it's worth mentioning how much time he's spent in Saudi Arabia and how many different capacities. 15 years in the country, working at the embassy in Riyadh, the consulate in Jeddah and Dhahran, working as a charge d'affaires, deputy chief of missions, political counselor, economic counselor, commercial counselor, and commercial attaché. You'll have to tell us, David, how you're able to have such expertise and such extensive experience in the kingdom. Is quite unusual within the State Department. We're also joined by Victor McFarlane, who is an associate professor in Missouri, right? University of Missouri, at the Department of History there. Where his research centers on energy, the environment, US relations with the Middle East, and of course, a special focus on Saudi Arabia. I definitely really recommend to you his book, Oil Powers, A History of the US-Saudi Alliance, which is just published this year by Columbia University Press. And really, I think it's, we have many books, we have several books on the US-Saudi Alliance, from a kind of more generalist perspective, but it's really great to get this more in-depth historical study. And I don't think there have been that many in-depth historical studies of this relationship. So it's really a real contribution that I commend to all of you. So I thought we would start, of course, we want to get into a lot of these contemporary issues, but I want to draw upon, as I mentioned, both of these books really delve into the history, both of Saudi Arabia and of the US-Saudi alliance. And so I wanted to start the question by giving the speakers an opportunity to talk a little bit about their books, but also drawing upon this history to try to set us up today. David, I know in your book, a lot of the initial chapters, and even the way you structure the book, is really looking at these kind of pillars of Saudi stability. And we have this question all the time regarding Saudi Arabia, with a lot of people talking about, Saudi Arabia, is it, how stable is it? And why, it has been shown incredible stability even throughout dramatic changes over the decades. So maybe you can just answer that for us. I mean, why has Saudi Arabia been more stable than many experts have predicted?
I would say it has indeed been more stable than many people predicted, and it is today somewhat less stable than many people presume. It's not unstable, but it is certainly less stable than it was 5 years ago. And the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Why was it stable? There were really, in the model that I use in the book, there are really four pillars of Saudi stability. The first is the historic role that the Al Saud family played in creating the country. They actually unified the country of wandering tribes and small city-states. Took them 30 years to do that. And the fact that they put their name on the door of the company, they're the only country in the world that's actually named for a family. So they created this and they brought stability and prosperity to their people, and that gave them legitimacy as the founders of the country. That is somewhat less of a legitimizing factor today, because while people in their 50s and 60s can either remember or hearing from their parents about what Saudi Arabia was like before the Al Saud unified the peninsula or most of the peninsula. young people today, it's sort of like talking about George Washington. It doesn't quite have the same resonance. So it was a feature of stability and legitimacy, but it's less so today. The second thing that they did was the second pillar, if you will, of their legitimacy and their stability, which are quite a bit the same, was their ability to have succession smoothly, peacefully, quickly, to have succession. They did it 6 or 7 times in the last 50 years, and that again is unusual. There are many Arab countries that are unable to do that, and that again contributed to legitimacy and stability. That today is a little bit more uncertain. I wouldn't say that it's very uncertain, but usually there are a king and a crown prince and a deputy crown prince. Today there is no deputy crown prince. So there is no number 3 person. And so the Saudis suffer from what in the financial world is often called key man risk, which is to say, if something were to happen to Mohammed bin Salman, who would replace him? His father went to great efforts to engineer his rise to power. This transition to the 3rd generation was not going to be smooth. There were going to clearly be people who were pushed aside and were angry. His father engineered that. Whether he has the mental and physical capacity to do it again if something happened to Mohammed bin Salman is an open question. The third leg of stability is the coalition of elites, that the stakeholder elites that the Al Saud assembled. Just very quickly, those are the tribes, the merchants, the royal family itself, the technocrats, and the ulama, or religious establishment, which is really more than just the ulama. And without going into a lot of detail, each of those groups has some reason to be disgruntled, some more than others, but the changes that are taking place have disenfranchised or annoyed, if you will, all of them in some way or another. And then the final pillar of their stability was the ability of the monarchy to deliver competent government. And what do we mean by competent government? We need security, which means that it's safe in the country, but also that the country stays out of foreign wars, which they were remarkably successful at doing. It also implies economic development, and it implies, or it includes gradual social change at a pace that a essentially conservative and religious community could accept. Again, all of those things are being challenged to some extent now. The country is at war, has been at war for 5 years. That's an unusual experience for Saudis. Saudis are coming home in body bags. That's unusual. The economy is going through a difficult period. It was going through a difficult period when oil prices were going down 4 or 5 years ago, and it's going through a very difficult time now with COVID. And then the question of gradual social change is actually not gradual at all now. And I would say that while most people, and the overwhelming majority of people are pleased with the pace of social change, the fact remains that there's probably 20% of the people who think that it went too far, too fast, ought to be rolled back, and there's a potential for a backlash there. So that's perhaps more than you wanted to know, but the model is that there are these 4 legs of stability: historic legitimacy, the ability to handle succession, the coalition of stakeholders, and then competent government. And each of those has been whittled away to some extent by all the changes which are happening. And I want to just conclude this part by saying that it's inevitable that the country would be less stable when it was changing. Anything that's changing rapidly is by definition less stable than something that is static. And Saudi Arabia is changing rapidly. So almost by definition, it's a bit less stable than it was when it was static.
Before I move on to Victor, I'm just curious. I mean, you outline in your book all of these pillars. And as you just mentioned, many of them, if not all of them, have been pretty dramatically transformed or shifted. Why do you think they were if these were working so well as a form of stability, why do you think they are changing?
Well, that's a good question. Because they had to change. Because basically the model was economically unsustainable. The Saudi welfare state, this is really for Victor to talk about, but the fracking revolution shifted the supply curve for global energy. And the Saudis were not going to enjoy $120 barrel of oil anytime again soon. and they had to rationalize their welfare state. They had to find a way to diversify their economy. They had to find a way to balance their budget. They had to find a way to increase government revenues beyond oil. All of this required both economic change, which is the core of Vision 2030, but that also required some social change. If you were going to be able to make a private sector work, you had to have some changes in the way that the society functioned as well. And I would add to that, that part of all of this is simply a generational change. I think that should be emphasized as well, that Mohammed bin Salman is the leader of this parade, if you will. But to some extent, he's doing what General de Gaulle recommended, which is embrace the inevitable. The majority of Saudis are under 30 years old. The majority of Saudis want to go to movie theaters, want to listen to music, want to be able to sit in a restaurant with someone of the opposite sex who's not their spouse. So he was, if you will, going with the tide. He wasn't dragging the people kicking and screaming, but he was going with the tide. So I think all of these things, those are the two main reasons. One, the generation was changing, and two, the economy had to change.
Thank you. Victor, I wanted to turn to you because in your book, you go into really some depths in trying to understand these two oil powers. And you do go some way in describing not just Saudi Arabia, but the United States too as an oil power. And trying to understand really the fundamentals of this US-Saudi alliance. And I'll underline that you do call it an alliance, which is probably going to earn you some kind of pushback.
That's true.
But I wanted just to give you a chance to speak to that a bit. What do you see as the fundamentals of this alliance, and how do you see that changing?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Jerry, for introducing us. And I want to thank the Middle East Institute for having us today. In answer to your question, my book charts how the US-Saudi relationship has developed since the early 20th century. And ultimately, of course, that relationship is largely based on oil because it's oil that provided the financial resources for the Saudi monarchy since the mid 20th century. And without oil, that relationship would look very different. But it's never been as simple as Saudi oil provided for American consumption. Most Saudi oil has always gone to other consumers, and all the more so now since the shale revolution in the US. So that relationship has always been based on quite a bit more than just the delivery of Saudi oil to the US. It's Saudi oil going to American allies and keeping the world price in a range that US policymakers are comfortable with. It's military cooperation, intelligence sharing between Washington and Riyadh, cooperation against other actors that leaders of both countries see as common adversaries. For a long time, that was the USSR and its allies, more recently, Iran. So I'm being a bit provocative, you're right, in calling this relationship an alliance. And it's true that there isn't a formal defense treaty between the US and Saudi Arabia. But I think it's an alliance in all but name. Since the Carter Doctrine of 1980 at the latest, it's been very clear, the US has made it very clear that the United States would come to Saudi Arabia's aid if attacked with military force if necessary. So if that's not an alliance, I'm not sure what is. And given that the relationship is based on so much more than oil alone, the direct delivery of oil, that means that the shale boom of the last 10 to 15 years hasn't affected the alliance nearly as much as you might think. Something else that I argue in my book is that the stories we tell about the US-Saudi relationship don't always give enough weight to the opposition in both countries to that relationship. Of course, today there's a good deal of criticism of Saudi Arabia from some quarters in the United States because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the increased authoritarianism of the monarchy under King Salman and his son Mohammed, Saudi involvement in Yemen, et cetera. And these specific issues might be new, but criticism of the relationship goes back many decades. You can go back right to the beginning, to the 40s and 50s, and many members of Congress were already much more skeptical of the relationship with Saudi Arabia than the executive branch tended to be. They objected to Saudi Arabia's policies on Israel. the suppression of the labor movement, religious intolerance, lots of other issues. And in Saudi Arabia, of course, there's been opposition, which a lot of Americans think first of the Islamist opposition, but historically, of course, the Arab nationalist left and other kinds of dissidents were even more significant. So the last point I'll make is that I should be clear, I'm pretty critical of some aspects of this relationship in my book. It's had costs for the Saudi people and for the people of other countries in the region like Yemen, and their costs for the United States to being associated with those policies. So perhaps we can talk more about that down the road.
Sorry, I had muted myself because my dog was barking.
Wow.
Let's turn to the King Salman era then, and kind of push things a little bit further. And so you have outlined, and you started to do this, David, or maybe actually I'll stick with Victor right now. You've talked about some of these changes that have taken. You talk about actually that the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is built on more than oil. But do you think some of these changes that David Rundell spoke about, the changes in the oil market, fracking, shale oil, does that mean that you don't think that those things are fundamentally going to shift the Saudi-U.S. relationship?
I think eventually they will. I think there's no question that if oil prices remain as low as they are right now, ultimately that'll undermine Saudi power, and it'll certainly make the monarchy, it'll force them to do things differently than they've done in the past. And it's true also that the US-Saudi relationship was based in large part in the past on what the United States thought Saudi Arabia could do to influence the world oil market. And my book looks especially at the 1970s, when, because of this general perception that oil was running out all over the world because of the Arab oil embargo in 73 to 74, American officials placed a much higher priority on relations with Saudi Arabia than they had before. So the shale boom in the United States means that some of those arguments no longer seem quite as compelling. I think that in the short run, the shale boom is still affected the U.S.-Saudi alliance not nearly as much as you might think. And one example of that is that I think you could argue that the Trump administration's relationship with the Saudi monarchy is just about the closest relationship between a U.S. presidential administration and the Saudi monarchy that we've ever seen. And Trump prioritized relations with Saudi Arabia, visiting it very early in his presidency. So far, the shale oil boom has, I think, had a pretty minimal effect on the US-Saudi alliance. But in the long run, if prices remain this low, then Saudi Arabia will have less influence in the region. US officials will be less concerned about maintaining Saudi cooperation on oil prices. Ultimately, I think that would cause a downgrading or a reassessment of the alliance, but I don't think it's happened yet.
Let me turn
Can
to
I
David.
comment on that just for a second?
Sure, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I would simply say two things really. First is something that most people are well aware of, that oil is traded on a global market, and while the United States does not import much oil from Saudi Arabia, as Victor said, our allies, particularly Japan and Korea, do, and many countries, including the United States, purchase oil at a global price, effectively a global price. So that if Saudi Arabia's production was reduced dramatically for any reason, we would feel that in the United States. And even if somehow we were able to isolate ourselves, our trading partners and our allies would feel it. So we are not immune to what happens in Saudi oil fields. The second point that I would make is that I hear people sometimes say, and this goes directly to the first question you asked me about the stability of Saudi Arabia. I hear people argue, well, whoever controls Saudi Arabia will have to sell us their oil, and it doesn't really matter if the monarchy survives or not. And I think that's actually a dangerous concept. That's about as far-fetched as to say that when we get to Baghdad, we're going to find people throwing roses in the street. To think that it is automatic that the Saudi oil production would remain the same without the monarchy is naive. And I'll give you some idea about why that is. To sell your oil, you first of all must be able to produce it. So to produce it, you need political stability. You don't need a dozen tribes fighting over oil wells like you have in Libya. Libya is a good example. Iraq is another example of countries where Yemen is another example where political stability collapses and then oil production collapses. And when you lose 1 million barrels of Yemen or of Libyan oil, that doesn't matter too much. If you lose 10 million barrels of Saudi oil, that makes a huge difference. So you need political stability. The second thing you need is well-managed oil fields that are effectively managed and which require continuous investment and continuous drilling. Most oil fields decline by about 8% a year, so you've got to keep making that up all the time. Good examples of that would be Iran and Venezuela. Venezuela is exporting 300,000 barrels a day. They were used to export 1 million. When the Saudis exported 1 million back when they started OPEC, they each were producing 1 million. Today, the Saudis could produce 12 million. The Venezuelans are lucky to get 300,000. Again, Iran used to produce almost 7 million barrels a day under the Shah. Today, they'd be lucky if they could do half of that because they mismanaged their fields. So the first point I was making is that if you're going to sell your oil, you've got to produce it. The second point about the Saudis is that they, as Victor said, they play a stabilizing role in the oil market in the sense that they are the Federal Reserve of oil. What do we mean by that? They are the only country, again, the only country in the world that drills wells and then shuts them in. And they maintain about, most people know this, about 2 million barrels a day of spare capacity, which they use and adjust to stabilize markets. They like prices that are high, but not so high that they cause people to drill in the Arctic or insulate their house or buy an electric car, or to drive the global economy into recession. So they manage prices, and there's no guarantee that any other country or government would take on this role, which is unique to the Saudi monarchy. And then the final argument I would make is that when I hear people tell me, well, even ISIS used to sell their oil, so it doesn't really matter who runs Saudi Arabia, my answer to them is, you really want ISIS to own Aramco? That would be nice. Then we could have the Islamic Republic of Arabia, and we could have a Revolutionary Guard financed by Aramco. So I think that the idea that it doesn't matter who runs Saudi Arabia because we're going to get the oil anyways, I think is a fiction and needs to be re-examined. So anyway.
I imagine Victor may want to come in on some of these things, but let me press you a little bit on some of those things, because as you said, your book was premised on stability of Saudi Arabia. But you yourself just said that you think under some of the changes, dramatic changes that we see under King Salman, it may be somewhat less stable. And I think, some of these things that you just talked about, we can see some of these shifts, right? So if we want to stick to the issue of oil policy, in fact, during the drop in COVID, when we saw this kind of confrontation that happened within OPEC, we saw a much more willing to see a more assertive Saudi Arabia, kind of in line with the new nationalist posture. So I'm wondering if you see some of these changes. We can talk about whether in the oil market, and Victor, of course, I welcome you to jump in on this because this is what your discusses.
He's the oil expert. I just talk too much.
Let me ask Victor then about that. And then I'd like to bring you back into just to see if the first premise is that you need to have stability. I want to see if you exactly how you see things under the King Salman period, and where the elements of change are helping to move Saudi Arabia forward, and where we see perhaps
Absolutely, that's a great question. I'll be happy to answer it. But
well, Victor, let me bring you in first, and Victor, let me even expand that. I'm curious what you think about not only some changes in the way that Saudi Arabia, broaden it, I guess, how they're approaching kind of their oil production and where oil positions itself within the overall economy. And you could also talk more broadly about the Vision 2030 program and your sort of assessment of where Saudi Arabia is going with that. And I'd love for you to bring in some of your historical kind of perspective on that.
Sure. I should say, though, that I'm not really an expert on contemporary Saudi oil policy. There are other folks who know the details of that better than I do. But I can say, of course, that Mohammed bin Salman has placed a big rhetorical priority on transitioning away from dependence on oil. That's in part a response to the developments of the last 10 to 15 years, the American shale oil boom, which has made it harder for Saudi Arabia to play that traditional swing producer role that they aspired to. They certainly still have a lot of influence in the oil market. If they open the taps and dump a bunch of spare production on the market, they can certainly send prices lower, or even by refusing to act. We've seen that happen a few times in the last decade. If the market expects Saudi Arabia to cut production and they don't, that alone can send prices lower. But they have a more limited ability to boost prices than they used to, in part because of the shale oil boom, now because of the COVID recession as well. And ultimately, perhaps because of the transition away from fossil fuels. And it's debatable how much we're seeing the impact of that yet on the oil market, but I think that the Saudi leadership, along with just about everyone else, is more doubtful about the future demand for oil on a long time span of decades than they were back in the 70s, for example. Now, in terms of the Vision 2030 plans that Mohammed bin Salman has touted as an answer to that problem, that Saudi Arabia will diversify its economy. There are certainly attractive features of those, some of the plans that he's offered, and some of it goes along with a degree of social liberalization that's been widely welcomed by some folks in Saudi Arabia and outside. I don't think we should underestimate the difficulty of what Mohammed bin Salman is proposing to do economically, though. The Saudi leadership has been promising economic diversification since the middle of the 20th century. You can go back to what King Saud was saying all the way back in the 50s, and he was promising to diversify the Saudi economy and reduce reliance on oil. It was a very large priority for the Saudi leadership in the 70s. They poured huge investments into industrialization during the oil boom in the 70s. But in most sectors, it's very, very hard for Saudi Arabia to develop large non-oil sources of revenue. And there's nothing on the immediate horizon that would replace the kind of revenue they get from oil. So economically, that's just a very difficult thing to pull off. And I think it remains to be seen how much of Vision 2030 will happen. It's clearly in part aspirational. I think it's fair to say Saudi Arabia will not be able to dispense with oil revenue by the year 2030. But what degree of those plans will actually happen, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. David, let me bring you back in then on the question that I asked you. And actually, let me fold in a question. We're already getting some questions in the Q&A, which is excellent, in the Q&A box. And one of them is very much directly linked to the question that I was asking you. And they mentioned that your 4 pillars, sorry, this is from Mark Moody Stewart, that these 4 pillars and trends have been changed or weakened in the King Salman era, as we were just discussing. And he mentions that stability or change was achieved, at least in part, by supporting increased repression and human rights abuses. So do you see these, and I'm rephrasing, you see these human rights abuses as something as a barrier to development, especially as Saudi Arabia is seeking to get more Western investment? Or do you see the possibility that, sorry, I'm just trying to read this. It's a long question. Do you think that this is going to be a continuation in this era, that we're going to see this increased repression as an element of a constituent element of the change?
It's a great question. The change, Saudi Arabia had a political system that was very collegial. There were a group of senior princes who ran the country. They operated through consensus. They were often indecisive, decisions were slow, and things were quite stable. This has been stood on its head for reasons which I think were necessary, that it couldn't really have continued the way it was. for several reasons. One, as I mentioned, that the supply curve for global energy had shifted. Two, there was a generational change of young people who wanted change. And three, people say that King Salman ended the old system. He didn't end the old system. The old system ended itself. The last brothers died. The system had to change. You needed to make a transition from the second generation princes, of which there were 34, to the third generation princes, of which there were 500 at least, who all thought they should be the next king. And so you had a real possibility of, number one, you didn't have the possibility of a consensus driven system with 500 people all having a voice. And number two, you did have the possibility of instability and some sort of Game of Thrones. So the new system is much more centralized. It's much more authoritarian. It's much more decisive. It makes decisions quickly. And it's probably somewhat less stable. The question that he asks is, how is Saudi Arabia going to evolve? I do not have a crystal ball that can tell me which course it's going to take, but I don't think it's going to stay the way it is. I believe it will evolve either into a police state, a very authoritarian police state, or into a more accountable monarchy. I don't think it's likely to, in the next 10 years, to become a democracy, but it could become a more accountable monarchy. I say I don't know which of those is going to happen. I see no sign really of the liberalization taking place now. If you look at what you see nothing but more authoritarianism. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia, unlike almost any other Arab state, has an inherent, the Saudi monarchy has an inherent legitimacy, which will allow it to evolve. It is not predicated like the Ba'ath regimes of Iraq or Syria or the military dictators that run Egypt. These are dictatorships, and they're primarily operate through fear and repression. The Saudi government has never really been a police state. They have, as I said, for a number of reasons, been considered legitimate by a majority of their people, and there is a potential for them to evolve, as other monarchies did in Europe. We as Americans didn't have that experience. We tend to think that all monarchies are evil because our experience with King George III was that he was a tyrant. But there are many monarchies which were able to evolve gradually. It took them hundreds of years. Some had civil wars to do it, but they were able to evolve. So I think there's a chance that the Saudi monarchy could evolve. And the point I wanted to make here is that we have a stake in that evolution. We have a big stake in that evolution, and we cannot have any influence if we are not engaged with the Saudis. So the idea that somehow we should walk away from Saudi Arabia and just leave them on their own, I think is fatuous, in part because I've explained that the oil market would be influenced by instability there. And secondly, because if we believe in our own values, we should want them to be developed there. And there is a potential for that to happen. And we can only influence it if we stay engaged with them.
Can I just fold in, as you were talking about that, and we're getting a lot of questions, so I want to make sure we get to those. When you were talking about the changes, one thing that you didn't mention was the change with the religious authority. And Michelle Majlin here is asking, kind of not only what role is that, but how do you see this transforming in the kingdom? She mentioned that it seemed like her overnight the power was revoked, and she had lived there before, when the Mutawa were quite present and an important element, of Saudi social control in the kingdom and political control.
The place became more authoritarian. I'll be very quick. Let Victor answer this, but you needed a stick to get those people off the street. Okay, they didn't voluntarily all just say, "Oh, yeah, we're going to retire, and there's not going to be any more religious police." No, it took an authoritarian regime to tell them that the time was up, and to put them back in their police stations. And in fact, they didn't fire them. They found them another job and tried to retrain them and did things with them. They still getting paid, but they took them off the street, and that was you needed somebody. That really is why the king picked Mohammed bin Salman, quite frankly. Tom Friedman wrote an article in which he said, if you think there are another dozen princes in Riyadh who are as ambitious and as ruthless and as cunning as Mohammed bin Salman, you're wrong. And I think that Tom Friedman was right about that this guy is a bulldozer, and you needed a bulldozer to get the religious police off the street. And then and let's be clear, it wasn't just getting the religious police off the street. Then they began to reform the education system, which is the heart and soul of the religious establishment and what they believe is their way to influence society, much more so than having a few religious policemen tell you to go to prayer, is having religious teachers give you an instruction in the kind of Islam that they would like you to have. So to change that took a strong leader. And by definition, one who is perhaps a little more authoritarian, in fact, a lot more authoritarian. So anyway, I think that she's right. And those two things go together, the authoritarian government and the removal of the religious establishment. They're not totally removed. I wouldn't want you to think they're totally gone, but they're certainly diminished.
Victor, we're getting more questions about diversification from oil, including how you think, I guess you've already answered in some part, but how successful you think this will be, especially these kind of dramatic shifts as we see towards a completely different type of development, such as the Neom project. And I guess folding into that, there was another question about the importance then in these kinds of projects. We see that the American and Saudi strategic and friendship partnership is going to be very different, and the need, and this is coming from Mark Stanfield, for soft skills efforts that can sorry, I thought he was talking in terms of the kind of skills. So let me just ask you that question in terms of the kind of investment and technology transfers that you would see in a project like Neom. So how do you see those sorts of relationships being built?
That's a good question. When we're talking about Neom, there are aspects of that project that are really quite fantastical, and that are similar to some of the previous mega projects that Saudi Arabia has engaged in, building new cities that are going to be finance cities or cities of science and technology. There were projects along those lines under King Abdullah. And many of them never lived up to their billing or were never fully completed, never matched the hopes that were invested in them. So I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical of the Neom plans, and certainly the idea that it would be a major revenue generator that would be at all equivalent to the kind of revenue Saudi Arabia gets from oil, even in an era of low oil prices. But it does certainly show that Mohammed bin Salman is thinking big, and he's not afraid to do new things. I agree with David absolutely that that the shackling of the religious police was something that it's hard to imagine that happening under a earlier version of the Saudi monarchy that was more consensus oriented, much more cautious. Mohammed bin Salman has a different governing style. And as for economic diversification, it's clear that Saudi Arabia needs to try something new, and that diversification is necessary. I think it's just going to be very, very difficult to pull off many of those projects. Now, if they are to be pulled off, that's one reason why Saudi Arabia still has a major incentive to maintain its partnership with the US government, because there's a long history of American technical assistance and development assistance to Saudi Arabia. I looked at a lot of examples of that in the 1970s with the Joint Economic Commission and groups of American experts dispatched to Saudi Arabia to assist economic development in all sorts of different sectors. So there are a lot of precedents for this kind of thing. Mohammed bin Salman is a bit less focused on those government to government connections and more interested in expertise through private actors like McKinsey. But the general outlines of those sorts of reform projects and bringing in experts from outside to advise on or legitimize those projects, that's characteristic of Saudi governance going back decades.
Yeah, I would just add to that about Vision 2030, a couple of points. First, Victor is 100% correct that they have been talking about doing this for a long time, and they have made very little progress. They have made some rather profound changes in the way that they're doing business now. The 5-year plans, of which we're now at the 10th one, were drawn up by a minister of planning and then thrown in everybody else's drawer and never looked at, because there was a series of fiefdoms. Stefan Hertog talks a lot about this in his book, that there were many different senior princes who ran their own little ministries and their own little kingdoms, and their own little economic ecosystems, and did their own thing. That's all come to an end. There is now very clearly one guy in charge. You don't get any money from the central budget unless he approves it, and you don't get money approved unless he won't approve it, unless it's very specifically targeted toward Vision 2030 and achieving something. And these consultants, which they have hired, have, without going into details, they've created an elaborate system of monitors, of key performance indicators. People are held accountable now on a regular basis. None of this ever happened before. So there is a much more dramatic push towards achieving these goals than there ever was before. There's a sense of urgency. There's also a sense of optimism amongst a lot of young Saudis that actually something is getting done now. Now, I don't think that the Saudis are going to become South Korea anytime. They're always going to be dependent on oil. But then Canada and Australia are also very heavily dependent on exports of natural resources. So there's nothing wrong with that. What they had to do was diversify to lessen their total dependence on oil. And I think they have a shot at doing that. I think they should have called it Vision 2050 rather than Vision 2030. But they have achieved some of these goals in the past. And while some of their projects failed, Yanbu and Jubail, and I was there when they started Yanbu and Jubail, and they were nothing but dirt in the ground. There was nothing there. And people said, this is a joke. Who's going to build a petrochemical plant in the middle of the desert? Those are now mega cities, mega industrial cities that produce 10% of Saudi GDP. So it's not completely fatuous what they're trying to do. I think some of it will succeed. And the final thing to say is some of it already has succeeded, in the sense that before COVID, they were moving towards a balanced budget, and they have definitely imposed fiscal reform that they talked about for years and never did. They finally started to impose taxes. They finally started to cut gasoline subsidies, water subsidies, electricity subsidies. And these are real. They really did these things. So it's a little bit more tangible than it has been in the past, which is not to argue with Victor that it's not going to be very difficult. It's very difficult to move from being so dependent on oil, but I don't think it's a hopeless case either.
Well, Saudi Arabia has been changing both its economy and also we can talk about its foreign policy too. We've seen an increasing kind of multilateralism in the different countries that they're reaching out to, and we have a lot of questions here relating to Saudi Arabia's relationship with other countries. Susanna Choi asked if you would characterize Saudi Arabia's relationship with Russia and China. We have another question from Dr. Hushinam, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, about Saudi Arabia's relationship with India. Another one, of course, about the new relations with Israel and how that might change things. So that's throwing a lot on the table, but I guess I would ask both of you just to respond to how you see Saudi Arabia's foreign policy developing, and if you want to pick up the themes of any of these questions that are being asked by people with some of these other countries, or do you see that as being more increasingly important?
Well, you want to, Victor, why don't you go ahead? You can talk about a couple of countries and then I'll talk about a couple other ones if you want. Unless you want me to go first, I'm happy to if you want.
My expertise is really in the US-Saudi relationship, so I could talk a bit about how that might change over the next couple of years. But David, if you want to speak to some of those other countries, by all means.
Well, I think the one that's most interesting to people is Israel. The others you can talk about quite quickly. I mean, China is now Saudi Arabia's biggest customer. They have a strong economic relationship there. They've agreed to be part of the Silk Road. Russia is important to them because they have OPEC plus. So they have a much stronger relationship with China and Russia than they've ever had before. Does that make the United States happy? Probably not, but it doesn't really undermine the the depth of the relationship that the United States and Saudi Arabia have. India is a growing economic partner. The Saudis are investing in petrochemical plants and refineries there, and India is a big customer of Saudi Arabia. That's complicated by the fact that Saudi Arabia is also a long-standing ally and strategic ally, really, with Pakistan. But the one that I think is most interesting is Israel. As I said, I think in the beginning, Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. The reason for the United States to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, actually, as Victor said this, that the reason that we have this relationship with Saudi Arabia is because we are both status quo powers. We both have a lot to lose. We both like things the way that they are. The elements of that relationship vary. Sometimes we're both opposing Nasser. Sometimes we're both opposing Osama bin Laden. Sometimes we're both opposing the Soviet Union. Sometimes we're cooperating on oil prices. But the core is that we both want stability. And the Saudis view the Arab-Israeli conflict as a destabilizing factor. So they would like it to be resolved. And they have tried to resolve it a number of times. And without going into the long history of King Fahad's plan and King Abdullah's plan, they pushed the Arab consensus further towards a settlement with Israel than it had ever been before. And they've maintained that position for some time. Now, for them, the equation is changing again. The cost-benefit analysis that the Saudis, and certainly that the UAE went through, has changed. The opportunity cost of not having relations with Israel has gone up. The cost of not having a defense relationship, of not having investment, of not having technology transfer, of not having tourism, the cost of that is now much more than it once was 25 years ago, particularly in light of the COVID, which has sent their economy into a tailspin. So the cost has gone up, and at the same time, the benefit, which was largely a psychological or political benefit, not an economic benefit, has gone down. The psychological benefit of being part of the Arab nationalist movement doesn't mean much to kids under 30, young people under 30. Again, if you go to Saudi Arabia and you talk about what the UAE did, you will find a very stark and very sharp division between generations. People who are 50 and 60 are appalled. How could we betray the Palestinians? People who are 30 say, I could care less. I'd like to go to Tel Aviv. I'd like to do business with them. So, and the Palestinians haven't helped themselves. I mean, people don't want to hear that, but that's what people think in Saudi Arabia. And also they weren't that grateful to us either, because we all remember that they sided with Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. So there's a lot less sympathy than you might expect for the Palestinians in Saudi Arabia. So the other things which have changed, two things. One is that they now feel threatened. More threatened than they were. They feel threatened by Iran, and to some extent by, this is again, people may not think this, but they feel threatened by the Islamist movement, and the leader of that at the moment tends to be Turkey. So they feel threatened by that. And therefore they look to Israel as a potential ally in that situation. And they're also a little worried that the United States might pull out of the Middle East, and therefore they'll need another friend. So for all of those reasons, the UAE has moved forward. The Saudis are not going to move. They're not going to move next, I don't think. They are held back by two facts. One is that they have a special role as the custodian of the holy places. So they have a role in Islam, which makes it difficult for them to get out in front. And secondly, as I said, they're confronted by two groups, which they view as adversaries, one led by Iran and the other led by Turkey. And in case you didn't know, there's an informal boycott of Turkish goods right now in Saudi Arabia. So they don't want to give their opponents a stick to beat them over the head with. So I don't think they're going to get out in front, but I do think that quietly they are and will continue to work behind the scenes to encourage more states to come to some kind of recognition with Israel. And the final thing to say on this is that people talk about whether anything will happen before King Salman dies. King Salman is obviously of an older generation. He's not 60, he's 80. He is clearly one of the people who feels some loyalty to the Palestinian cause, and also takes his job as custodian of the Holy Mosque very seriously. King Salman has not said he would not recognize Israel. King Salman has been very clear that under certain conditions, which were spelled out in the Arab peace plan, he'd be more than happy to recognize Israel. In fact, he would like to recognize Israel. So what I think is that it's not something that can never happen until King Salman has left the scene, but I think it would require more than what happened to get, say, Sudan or Bahrain to sign up. So I think that would be perhaps too much what you wanted to hear, but did I answer that? I sort of talked about China, Russia, India, and a lot on Israel.
Well, let's actually, we're running out of time, and we're getting a lot of questions. I think people are watching the election returns coming in and curious about a future Biden administration. So I wanted to turn back to the US-Saudi relationship, and there were some questions about what sort of advice you would give to a Biden administration. I want to turn to Victor on that. I welcome you to answer that question, but also just more broadly, because your book kind of touches on this. I'm also just curious what sort of influence you think the United States has over internal Saudi affairs and reform efforts. So maybe you can wrap that into your answer about what you're looking towards a future Biden administration.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure how much influence the United States has, but whatever influence the U.S. government does have, I hope that they will use it. In terms of how the Saudi monarchy will relate to a Biden administration, assuming that Biden is president, they placed a lot of bets on Trump and on building a very close relationship with Trump. It hurt their relationship with the Democrats in Congress. It will probably make it more difficult to have a very close relationship with the Biden administration. That said, the alliance has proven very durable in the past. It's survived very serious challenges. The 1973 to 74 embargo, 9/11, when there was intense suspicion by a lot of the American public of Saudi Arabia. The alliance survived those challenges. And Saudi Arabia is a very important player in the region, even with less oil revenue than they used to have. Even if we set aside the changes in the oil market and Saudi Arabia's continuing influence, they have a lot of influence on other actors in the region: Egypt, Bahrain, the government that they back in Yemen. So I don't think any U.S. administration would have an alternative to dealing with Saudi Arabia, to doing a lot of work with them. But I do hope that a Biden administration would be more willing to speak up about the authoritarian abuses in Saudi Arabia, the torture of political prisoners like Lujain al-Hathloul, the civilian suffering in Yemen. How much the United States can actually do to change Saudi behavior is an open question, but I think that effort needs to be made. And I do think that even the economic reforms that Mohammed bin Salman is promising, it's hard to imagine those being very successful. Saudi Arabia becoming a tech hub, for example, when the kingdom has the reputation that it has right now because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and some of the other events of the last few years. So I do hope that the United States will use whatever influence it has to try to alter that course.
Yeah, I would just add two things, really. First of all, much of the animosity towards Saudi Arabia, it's absolutely correct that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the war in Yemen, play a part in that. But also the fact that Trump was so closely aligned to Saudi Arabia. If you were against Trump, you were against Saudi Arabia. With a President Biden, that part of the problem will go away. In other words, I think I explained that. Hopefully I was clear that some of it was just a shadow of people's animosity toward Trump. The second thing is that you talk to Saudis themselves. They are worried about the fact that the Biden administration would be less, in their view, strict on the Iranians. But they have an interesting view that the Biden administration would be tougher on Turkey. I don't know whether that's true or not, but they seem to, I've heard that from several senior Saudis, that they think that that for some reason Trump has given Erdogan a pass on some of his activities, and that perhaps because the Biden administration would be closer to its European allies, who certainly are unhappy with some of Turkey's behavior, that might be a positive. So, and again, as Victor said, the relationship it's never stable. It's always, and it's often in free fall, but nations have interests more than friends. We have values, as Victor says, that we have to defend, but we also have interests that we have to protect. And any policy that ignores either one of those won't be successful, and in a democracy won't be sustainable. So we need to place an emphasis on our values, and I would close my remarks for the evening really by saying that we have quite a bit of influence in Saudi Arabia, and I can speak to that, having exerted some of it. And there are a number of cases in human rights issues where we have made a difference, where we have spoken up, and things have changed. And I think religious tolerance is one. There are still no churches in Saudi Arabia, but there is much less persecution of people having religious services. They're done quietly, but there's much less. That happened, and we were instrumental in bringing that about. So that's just one example. That was many years ago. It's not something recent, but I talk about that as something in the past, as a historical issue. So we do have influence, and we should use it. And I think that would be, looking at the clock,
I know.
time to call it a day.
I guess we're going to give the ambassador the last word then. We have lots of questions in the Q&A. I apologize that we didn't get to them all.
Kirsten, if you have time, I'm happy to sit and answer more questions.
No, I think we'll give our marching orders. That is a 1 hour event. So we'll go with that. So I apologize we didn't get to all the questions. Perhaps we can save them and you can consider them before, but we definitely thank all of you for joining us. I'm glad that at least through some of the answers that you did give, I see that some of these issues were brought up, and I'm happy to see that. And we're just delighted that both of you were able to join us and share a small element of your books. There's much more in the books. And of course, being in Washington, we dove into some of these more current policy issues, but I do hope that everyone will look to your books. And just thank you on behalf of the Middle East Institute for joining us. I see Ambassador Firestein there. I don't know if he's going to rejoin us to close the event. Perhaps not.
I can't restart my video, but
Sorry.
but I will say again, just echoing you, Kristen, thank you very much to all three of you for, I think, a very interesting and timely conversation. And I hope that everybody found it as informative as I did. So again, I have had the opportunity to read both David's book and Victor's book. They're both excellent, informative, and I hope that people will buy them and learn from them. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.